Hello and welcome to the first of the Unit 5 revision videos. As you can see, this unit is all about the racial state looking between 1933 and 1941. Now there are 4 different areas of this unit that you could see listed here. The one that we're going to be looking at in this video today is about the radicalisation of the state. We're going to be looking at Nazi racial ideology, the background to these policies. Then we're going to be thinking about the policies towards the asocials, homosexuals, the mentally ill, and also looking at the Roma and Sinti as well. Then there'll be a second video that will be on the other sections of this unit about policies towards the Jews. So this first bit is just going to be looking at Nazi racial ideology and then their policies towards groups other than the Jews. Before you begin, it would be a good idea to carry out a red pen, black pen activity and to brainstorm what you can remember without looking at any notes about the following topics that I've listed here. This will then show you what areas you need to pay really close attention to during the video and kind of give you a good idea of what areas you're also an expert into. So pause the video here if you'd like to do that. This unit is looking at the Nazi racial state and how policies towards different groups changed over time. Now, it's worth being aware broadly about how the Nazi regime developed because this is the background to what we're going to be learning about. So first of all, if we think about phase 1 between 1933 and 1934, the Nazis were establishing their legal basis of their dictatorship by this point and were carrying out what's seen as the legal revolution. Now there are some policies against people that are asocials, people that are mentally or physically disabled, that are carried out in this period. But at this time, the main focus of the Nazis was on establishing themselves. When we think about phase 2, between 1934 and 1937, it's all about trying to create a new Germany. They were trying to deal with things like the unemployment crisis at this point, and they were trying to make sure that Nazi propaganda won over the majority of the German citizens. Now that they'd established a dictatorship, they needed to try and make sure that they could continue to control Germany. So during this period, Hitler avoided confronting powerful groups like the army or the churches. He also knew that Germany wasn't ready for war, and so it wasn't fully radicalised by this point. However, by the time we get to 1938 to 1939, the regime has become highly radicalised. We can see that in their policies. For instance, the Night of Broken Glass happens in November 1938, because by this point, the Nazis are firmly embedded, they've consolidated their power, and Hitler is now ready to be able to pursue more extreme policies against the people he saw as racial enemies. We've already mentioned that Nazi attitudes changed over time. One thing did remain, and that was that they wanted to create this Volksgemeinschaft, this people's community. Now, they found it very difficult to define exactly what they wanted within that people's community, and they found it often much easier to try and define it in terms of the outsiders and people that weren't part of this ideal community. People were normally excluded from it based on one of these 3 grounds. First of all, some people were excluded for social reasons because their behaviour conflicted with the norms. And they might have also been excluded from it down to biological or racial reasons. For instance, the Roma and Sinti and Jews were excluded for this reason. And sometimes they're excluded based on ideological reasons, for instance, the communists who were a political threat. Today we're going to be thinking about the groups that are excluded for social or biological reasons. And what is very clear is that even though over time the Nazis became more radical with their policies, their attitudes and their theories towards minority groups was incredibly clear and consistent. They aimed to remove them or re-educate them and to try and create this people's community over time because they saw them as a threat to the harmony and unity of the Reich. And this is evident from all of their policies, even though these policies were often put in place on a kind of ad hoc basis. The other thing that we can tell is that over time they became more radicalised, especially after the outbreak of the Second World War. That allowed the Nazis to carry out policies that they previously wouldn't have necessarily considered. But that's a historiographical debate that we'll come back to. We're now going to look at three different aspects of Nazi racial ideology, and all of this underpins their policies and explains their horrendous thinking and their horrendous policies that come after. So first of all, we're going to think about this element of social Darwinism. Now, this was something that was very popular across Europe throughout the 19th century, throughout the 1800s, because it was used to justify lots of different policies in lots of different countries, and it was even used to justify this idea of empire as well. So in 19th century Europe, social Darwinists adopted these theories of natural biological selection. They then applied it in a rather unscientific way to human society in order to try and justify their ideas of racial superiority. Hitler himself became obsessed with the idea of the biological struggle between different races, and this fitted with his ideas on groups like the Jews. He viewed humanity as consistent of a hierarchy of races, with Jewish people, black people, and the Slavs as inferior races, whilst he believed that the Aryan race was the people of Northern Europe, and he believed that it was their job to try and rule over all the so-called inferior races. However, in order to try and ensure their success in this war of racial struggle, as he saw it, Hitler believed he needed to try and purify the stronger races by stopping intermarriage and trying to maintain racial purity. Therefore, the Nazi principles of racial hygiene justified policies like their sterilization and then later policies of euthanasia against the mentally and physically disabled, the Roma, and other people that they saw as racially undesirable. The next area of Nazi racial ideology you need to know about is the Volksgemeinschaft. Now, we've already talked about what this means, the fact that the Nazis wanted to create this people's community filled with the master race. This didn't necessarily include all people living in Germany, and not all people that were Aryan were actually part of this ideal community. To qualify as a member of the Volk or people, it was essential that you were a true German in terms of your racial purity, but also your loyalty to the regime and whether you fit into the social norms. The Nazis believed in this idea so much that they believed it was essential to try and ruthlessly eliminate all un-German elements, especially people that were Jews. The final area of Nazi racial ideology that you need to know about is this idea of Lebensraum, which is a German word which means living space. Now, like social Darwinism, this was not a new idea that was originated by the Nazis. It had actually been used throughout the later 19th century to try and justify space for the expanding and supposedly superior white race. In Germany, there was generally this widespread support for this idea that the country was overpopulated and farmers needed more land. Over time, that became more and more extreme as people were resenting the loss of land from the Treaty of Versailles. For instance, the fact that places like West Prussia had been taken and given to Poland. So many of Germany's civilians decided that Germany's destiny lay in the east, and that they had a right to try and conquer the supposedly inferior Slav peoples of Poland and the former Russian Empire to try and gain access to the fertile farmland and raw materials. Now, this is about growing space, but there's also lots of elements with this idea of Lebensraum about race, because Lebensraum would not only allow for the Germanization of the eastern lands and bringing the lost Germans back to the Reich, but more importantly, it would provide the battleground for a war of racial annihilation, wiping out the supposedly inferior Slav races and smashing Bolshevism in Russia. Remember that there was lots of ideas here about communists being the enemy and them being in league with the Jews and Jewish Bolshevism, as we can see in this image here. So this is a concept that is very much about race, but it's also something that has been twisted to be about anti-Semitism in particular as well. So that's what you need to know about Lebensraum. Pause the video here if you do want to make any revision notes about ideology and how this underpinned their racial policies. First group that you need to know about is Nazi policies towards the mentally ill and physically disabled. These were seen by the Nazis as being a biological threat and biological outsiders of the Volksgemeinschaft. So even if somebody was Aryan and they had some kind of disability, they were seen as being a threat to the nation and outsiders. The Nazis were really worried about the decline in birth rates, and we can see that through their policies towards women, where they tried to encourage them to have lots of children with the law for the encouragement of marriage, and also things like the Mother's Cross, where they celebrated motherhood. The Nazis weren't just worried about the decline in birth rates, they were also worried that there had been a lot of improvements with medicine, and they were therefore worried about the long-term health of the nation. They viewed people that were mentally ill or physically disabled as a burden on the community, and they said that they represented life without life. So they put out loads of propaganda like this image here, where they said about how much disabled people cost the German state each year to try and make other people feel the same as them and to support their policies of sterilisation. Use this false science, or so-called science of eugenics, to try and support their ideas, and they wanted to try and improve the health of the Aryan race through selective breeding. So this all began with sterilisation policy, and this is the first area that we need to know about, and then it moves to a policy of euthanasia by 1939. Obviously, the Nazis came to power in January 1933, and by July of 1933, they've introduced the sterilisation law, which made it compulsory where they had sterilisation for people they deemed as inferiors. So, for instance, people that had things like schizophrenia, or if they had chronic alcoholism, they would be compulsory sterilised. Now, the Nazis weren't the first people to introduce this, though. Prussia had actually drafted a law for voluntary sterilisation in 1932, and actually lots of the medical organisations in the area supported it. The reason why it didn't get passed is just because of the political chaos of the system at that point, where they were ruling using Article 48. So this is something that generally had the support of quite a significant proportion of the population. And obviously the Nazis then pass it when they first come to power using the Enabling Act. They later amended this law to not just be for older people, but they actually made it so that you could be sterilised from 10 years old and very forcibly from 14 years old, with no legal representation and nothing to be able to stop somebody doing this from you. They could collect children from school and go and carry it out without their parents even knowing. And as a result of this, 400,000 people were sterilised by 1939, 100 of them dying during the operations. This was carried out by the hereditary health courts, and there were lots of judges that strongly supported this policy and didn't have a problem with being part of this sterilisation law. They decided to try and use this not only to sterilise people that were mentally ill or physically disabled, people that had hereditary conditions that would be passed on to future children, but they also used this policy against Roma and Sinti gypsies, and also people that they saw as antisocial or asocial. And generally, as we've mentioned, it was supported by the German population. You might remember me showing you a little extract from a Nazi propaganda film called Erkrank from 1935, and that was one example of the kinds of ways the Nazis tried to build up fear and dislike of people that were disabled. They really emphasised through propaganda, like what you can see on the top right, and these propaganda films, the cost of care to try and get the German people on side with this policy of sterilisation and later euthanasia. And films like that were seen by 40 million people by 1939 because the Nazis played those films before any main kind of film attraction. Remember, there were over 5,000 cinemas and they were all playing these kind of propaganda films before the main event as well. So it wasn't just sterilisation from 1933. They also started allowing abortions from 1935 for those that they deemed unsuitable to have children. Obviously, they didn't accept people that were Aryan having abortions because Aryans that were healthy to have abortions because they wanted to increase the birth rate, but people that had some kind of hereditary illness, they were allowed abortions. And from 1936, they also introduced X-ray sterilisation of women over 38 because you are more likely to have a child with some kind of disability or health problem the older you are. So overall, Nazi policies towards the mentally ill and physically disabled from 1933, you need to know about the sterilisation law. Remember that it's 400,000 people that are sterilised, and generally the German public supported this because of the cost of looking after the disabled. You'd seen that the Nazis had been using the policy of sterilisation from July 1933, and this changed to a policy of euthanasia by October 1939. This all began when a father wrote a letter to Hitler that was read by somebody called Dr. Buller, where he was asking for his child, who he called the creature, to be given a mercy killing because of the amount of disabilities that this child had. Dr. Buller brought that letter to Hitler's attention, and Hitler advised euthanasia and said that that would be a wise choice for this child. Now, this then was then extended to being a law to allow euthanasia for all children that were disabled. And they decided that this was a policy of mercy killings. They didn't see this as evil. They saw this as for the good of Germany and the good of the children as well. So medical staff were expected to report on children with disabilities. Those children who were reported on were then sent to special hospitals to be given lethal injections, gassed, or they were starved to death. And this started with children and then was extended to adults later on. To try and encourage these medical staff to make sure that they reported these children, staff were paid on a piecework basis and for every child that they recommended for death. Only a few medical professionals actually objected to this policy. And as we can see, this policy was all brought into place by one dad who wrote about his child. The catalyst was with this child that had the letter written about them. The policy had been considered before that, though, but they had decided not to enact it before. However, with the outbreak of the Second World War, they are feeling more confident in their policies and the fact that they will be able to carry them out in secret. It also shows us the kind of chaotic nature of Nazi government and the fact that people were constantly working towards the Führer, because it's officials like Brandt and Buller who are the ambitious ones that are trying to get the Führer's attention by coming up with these new policies, and Hitler is just making these decisions off the cuff and then kind of creating a policy after this one individual has been given permission to be put down in a mercy killing. As a result of this horrendous policy, 5,000 innocent children are killed, and by 1944, it means that there are 200,000 murdered, including those children and also adults. The fact that they were killed in such a bureaucratic way actually provides the origins for the Holocaust, because they were using things like gas to try and kill as many as in one go as possible. And obviously that gas was then later used against the Jews as part of the Holocaust. So generally we've mentioned about the horror of this policy of euthanasia, 200,000 people murdered by 1944. And generally medical staff either supported it or were too scared to stand up and say anything about this. One individual that did stand up against the Nazis was the Catholic Bishop von Galen, who in August 1941 did this amazing emotive attack on euthanasia, backed by specific evidence. He read it out from a church pulpit, but he also got other people to read it out across Germany. Now, this then led to a hostile public reaction. A lot of German people had supported the policy of sterilisation, but this went too far, especially when they provided evidence about how some children had been starved to death or been killed through gassings. As a result, the Nazi regime had no choice but to temporarily halt the policy. He's timing this sermon in August 1941 at a time when the Nazis had really overstretched at this point and were now fighting still against Britain, but also now against the Soviet Union. They really needed their support, and therefore they decided that because it was during war, they couldn't just arrest von Galen and risk further protests, and instead they would temporarily halt the policy. Now, they did eventually carry on again in secret, but still, this was an amazing success for opposition. This is one of the only times when public protests actually worked, and it's really important that you know about this for the policies towards the mentally ill and physically disabled. But you can also use this in an exam question on opposition or about Nazi religious policies. Nazis did try and go against von Galen and get the public to support their policies, though, with a film that they introduced called I Accuse. This film in 1941 was all about a woman who was suffering, and her husband, who knew she was suffering, ended up, with her permission, killing her, and then he was punished. And the idea was that people would watch this, feel on the side of the husband, feel that euthanasia was actually the right choice, and therefore support the Nazi policy. So the Nazis did try and win the public round, but there wasn't ever mass support for this policy of euthanasia, and they had to keep it secret even after that film was released. One of the groups that you need to know about is the asocials. Now, asocials were seen by the Nazis as socially unfit, and therefore they were seen as a social threat to the Volksgemeinschaft. To be part of this people's community, you were supposed to be somebody that was seen as a useful member of society, and asocials were seen as the opposite of that. So generally, this term asocial is a bit of an umbrella term, and it was used to categorise the marginal groups of the German population that deviated from the norms of society and what the Nazis wanted them to be like. So it was a term that was applied in an elastic manner for those who were social outcasts and includes lots of different groups of people, including criminals, alcoholics, prostitutes, people that didn't actually have a fixed home, people that were seen as being work shy, and anybody else who did not, could not, or would not perform the duties to the national community. Now, generally, these people weren't very popular with ordinary communities in Germany anyway, so persecution of these groups was relatively easy, and the Nazis were confident in their policies. Often, the impetus for this persecution of asocials came from below and wasn't actually something that was brought in by the top levels of Nazi command. Instead, it was often driven by local initiatives rather than being that top level. For instance, in Hamburg, in the city, the local government decided between 1934 to 1935 to carry out a slum clearance scheme. And this is where they essentially demolished all of the housing that happened to house quite a lot of people that were seen as asocials and people that were generally seen as criminals as well. Now, overall, the last key point that you need to know is that the approach towards them became more hardened and systematic as time went on. So that was just a bit of an overview of who we mean by asocials and what the policies were like. Now we're actually going to look at what they did to these groups of people over time. So to start off with, the Nazis began persecuting people that were asocials immediately after they came to power. So remember that Hitler becomes Chancellor in January 1933. Now, by July, they've passed something called the Sterilisation Law, which we'll talk about in more detail when we look at their policies towards the mentally and physically disabled. However, even though this didn't officially apply to asocials, they actually did end up using this against asocials and compulsorily sterilised some people because their behaviour deviated from the National Socialist norms. By September of 1933, Goebbels decided to initiate something he called Beggars' Week, and this was a mass roundup of people that they saw as tramps and beggars. And we're talking about large numbers of people here, between about 300 to 500,000 people. Now, because of those large numbers, the Nazis then needed to divide them into people that were orderly and disorderly. They couldn't deal with that many people at that point. Remember that 1933 is incredibly busy for the Nazis in terms of concentration camps. They've set up their first one in Dachau in March 1933, but at this point they're still rounding up lots of political opposition because they only banned all other political parties in July 1933, and they haven't yet been able to arrest all of the SPD and communist leaders. So they divide them into the asocials that are orderly and disorderly. People that were seen as orderly asocials were people who were fit, willing to work, and had no previous convictions. And the Nazis tried to deal with them by giving them a permit, forcing them to work for their accommodation, and most of them were released from police custody. However, those that they saw as a more serious threat, those that were disorderly, were then sent to concentration camps. Sometimes when they were there, they were then sterilised and experimented on. In 1936, they started carrying out greater roundups of these asocials because the Olympics was going on that summer, and they wanted to try and present this hard-working and dynamic society to the rest of the world. We come to 1936 and the asocial colony at Hachschuld in northern Germany. Now this is really interesting because this was a Nazi social experiment. Now what they wanted to try and find out was whether they could reintegrate these people that they saw as being outside of society. They wanted to try and see if there was a way of educating them. So the Hachschuld, this asocial colony, is quite different to a concentration camp. There are some similarities between them in the sense that they couldn't leave, but actually this was kind of like a halfway between normal life and a prison. So the Nazis saw this as a welfare housing institution, and this was a colony that involved 84 houses, which was set up by the SS. So the idea is that they want to try and give them jobs to do while they're there, and they were testing them to see whether they could be re-educated and then brought back into normal German society. So usually families would stay here for a year, and this was actually an experiment that went on between 1936 and 1940. However, Hachschuld was generally seen as a failure by the Nazis. People like Himmler, head of the police state, didn't really like it. And therefore, in June 1938, Himmler and his deputy Heydrich ordered a wave of arrests known as the Right Campaign Against the Workshop, and over 11,000 individuals were rounded up and then sent to concentration camps, specifically somewhere called Buchenwald, and many of them died in those camps. So the policies towards the asocials does get more extreme over time. It starts off with roundups and then releasing many of them because they can't house them. Then they start this social experiment of this colony at Hachschuld, and then when they realise that it's a failure and it's too expensive for them, they decide to pursue this policy of putting people into concentration camps. So pause the video here if you want to make any notes about their policies towards the asocials. The next group that you need to know about is homosexuals and what Nazi policies were like towards them. Now on the next slide we're going to go through what the actual policies were, but to begin with we want to think about what was the position of homosexuals when the Nazis first came to power. Now technically homosexuality had been illegal and outlawed before the Nazis came to power in 1933. Since Germany was officially created in 1871, they had something in place called Paragraph 175, and this outlawed any physical sexual acts between men. Women and lesbians weren't mentioned at all in this law. However, despite the fact that that has been a law since 1871, homosexuality had flourished in Weimar Germany. It was a time when people were breaking down the social norms, and it was this kind of golden age of culture. Lots of people in the cities and places like Berlin had embraced these new changes and these new freedoms. So generally there was much more support in comparison to before when it came to homosexuality, although remember this kind of issue still divided German society, and there were big differences between how many people embraced it in the cities and how many people didn't embrace it in the countryside. Now, in Weimar Germany, there had even been some attempts by parties like the SPD to try and repeal and get rid of Article 175. The last attempt that they tried to do it in was 1929, but the Nazis ended up, along with other groups, blocking that act. So the Nazis, obviously their policies towards the homosexuals were awful. Their excuse, their justification, which obviously isn't a real justification, is that they felt that homosexuals were degenerate and a threat to the racial health of the people and their traditional family values. They wanted to try and increase the birth rate, and obviously people being gay would have an impact on how many of these racially pure Nazi children they were going to have. We can see their ideas emphasised by Himmler in 1937, who said that all things that take place in the sexual sphere are not the private affair of the individual, but signify the life and death of the nation. So you can see here the Nazi excuse for their policies. Therefore, the Nazis aimed to try and cure homosexuals if possible, and if not, to be able to discourage others. We're now going to look at Nazi policies towards homosexuals and how they changed over time. The Nazis began straight away with trying to purge gay organisations in 1933. They wanted to reverse the positive changes that had been made throughout the Weimar era, because remember there had been lots of clubs that had been created for gay people, especially in big cities like Berlin. So the Nazis began immediately to try and purge homosexual organisations and literature. They closed down clubs, they banned organisations for gay people, and they outlawed gay publications as well. Then in May of the same year, Nazi students decided to attack a gay organisation called the Institute of Sex Research, and they burned down its library. But quite crucially, they also seized the Institute's list of names and addresses of gay people, so they could then further persecute those individuals. The Gestapo also tried to root out and find anybody that was gay in 1934. By this point, they have already arrested a lot of political opposition to the Nazis. They've decided that they now want to branch out and try and deal with another group of people they see as a threat to the regime, people that were gay. So they also seized names and addresses of gay people, and they had lots of people who voluntarily denounced other people and gave names of people they suspected of being gay. About 60% of the people that were arrested for being gay were people that the Gestapo had been investigating or people that they'd found through the Institute of Sex Research and their lists. But about 40% of them came from people that privately accused other people of being gay. So it's just kind of like the Gestapo in the wider terror state, where they really did rely on ordinary Germans denouncing each other. Don't forget as well in 1934 that Rom, the leader of the Brown Shirts, the SA, was also killed, and one of the accusations against him was that he was gay. Now, the really crucial year that I want you to know about is 1935, because this is absolutely crucial to their legal persecution of homosexuals. We mentioned already that paragraph 175, which is saying that homosexuality is a crime, has been around since 1871. But in 1935, the Nazis made lots of changes to this, and they broadened the definition of homosexuality. The courts now saw it as a felony and could pursue any lewd act, even if there was actually no physical contact or any evidence of any contact between two people. They also included now harsher punishments on those that were convicted, and now people would be arrested and imprisoned for about 5 years. So as a result of these changes, more people are now included in the definition of homosexuality, and therefore more people can be arrested. So within 2 years, between 1935 and 1938, 22,000 men were arrested because now they've broadened that definition. But a really crucial figure to remember is that 100,000 men were arrested in total, and about 50,000 of them were convicted. This is still an issue for the Nazis in 1936 because we can see that through the fact that Himmler is then creating the Reich Office for combating of homosexuality and abortion. So this is clearly something that the Nazis really cared about that. We can see this in the escalation of their policy and the fact that they're carrying out different things throughout 1933 to 1936. It's an issue that they wanted to tackle immediately because they were really worried about the health of the nation. We can also see that through their policies towards women, where they had things like the law for the encouragement of marriage to try and encourage women to have 4 children. So we've already mentioned the key statistic that it's really important that you remember. I'm going to say it again just so you make sure you remember this one. So overall, 100,000 homosexual people, or people that were at least accused of being homosexual, were arrested in Nazi Germany. About 50,000 of them were convicted and then sent to a labour camp. Now, it was quite different in their policies towards men and women that were gay, because gay women were actually seen as asocial rather than degenerate, and they were not seen as being as big an issue, and therefore they weren't treated as harshly. Lesbian bars were closed down, but they weren't actually persecuted in the same way, because paragraph 175, even after the Nazis amended it in 1935, didn't even mention gay women, and therefore they were essentially left alone. For men, though, their treatment was brutal, and they were usually sentenced to 5 years in a labour camp. But once they'd reached the end of that sentence, they were often rearrested and had to serve another sentence back to back. Gay men in camps as well were also treated really unfairly by what they had to wear. Now, every prisoner in concentration camps had some kind of identification, and in the case of people that were in there for being gay, they would have to wear a pink triangle. But this was much larger than any of the other coloured triangles that people had to wear. It singled them out for particularly brutal treatment from guards, and often gay men were beaten to death in the camps if they wouldn't abandon their sexual orientation. And obviously, it's not a choice. So as a result, it's estimated that 60% died in the camps. About 30,000 gay men were killed, and a lot of them through terrible beatings and things that carried on. There was also this sense of trying to cure them. So the Nazis carried out loads of different experiments on loads of different groups throughout the concentration and extermination camps. And there were lots of attempts to try and cure them. For instance, at Buchenwald concentration camp, an SS physician, a man called Dr. Varnet, performed operations that involved the surgical insertion of a capsule which released the male hormone testosterone. The idea was that they would then make them, change their sexual orientation through hormones. This kind of procedure reflects the desire by Himmler and others to try and find a medical solution to homosexuality. And people that they couldn't cure, they decided to try and work to death through the labour camps. Now, the policies towards them under the Nazis were absolutely horrific, but what's also absolutely disgusting is the fact that many of these homosexual men actually had to continue their sentences after the war. In West Germany, they didn't basically change the terms of paragraph 175 until 1969. So the brutal treatment of gay men continued after the Second World War. If you've revised Unit 4, you'll already remember about Nazi policies towards the Catholic and Protestant Church, and you'll remember how they wanted to try and control them and then weaken their influence over time. They had to be very cautious with their policies, especially towards the Catholic Church, as the Catholic Church was very powerful and a significant proportion of the population supported it, just like the Protestants. Now, the Nazis did want to try and weaken religious influence, and they found it much easier to be able to do this with the smaller religious groups. So, for instance, in the first year when they came to power, they decided to try and ban some of these religious groups in November 1933. So groups, for instance, like Jehovah's Witnesses and the Mormons were banned. However, they lifted the ban if these different religious groups could show willingness to cooperate. So they ended up, for groups like the Seventh-day Adventists, they ended up removing their ban within 2 weeks, as this group had shown they weren't a threat to the regime. They provided a positive welcome for the regime. They talked about it being a period of rebirth, and they agreed to do things like displaying the swastika and concluding their services with the Heil Hitler greet. They also did things like excluding asocials and Jews from getting its well-developed welfare organisation charity handouts. So generally some groups cooperated with the Nazis, and as a result they were allowed to continue. The Gestapo still attended and reported on their services and watched them, but essentially life continued as normal for those groups. However, the survival of these groups was based on whether they compromised with the regime. And although most groups did, because they realised that was the only way that they could survive, there were some religious groups that actually carried out quite significant opposition to the Nazis. And the best example of this is the Jehovah's Witnesses. They were the only ones to show uncompromising hostility to the regime. And there are about 30,000 of them in Germany at this point. They refused to cooperate. They refused to do what the regime wanted. They wouldn't give the salute. They wouldn't participate in parades. And they wouldn't be conscripted into the army, which had been in force since 1935. And as a result, many of them were arrested. By 1945, about a third of their members, 10,000 people, were arrested, and many of them had died in these camps in these terrible conditions. But still, they held out and were still uncompromisingly hostile to the Nazis, and they actually even did things like converting other people whilst they were in these concentration camps. So generally, most groups compromised with the Nazis. However, some groups, for instance, Jehovah's Witnesses, were people that actually carried out more mass opposition to them. The final group that we're going to be looking at is the policies towards the Roma and Sinti. Now, first of all, a lot of these communities had been in Germany for a long time, and the Nazis didn't actually initiate the hostility towards them. Technically, since 1871, people that were Roma and Sinti were full and legal citizens of Germany. However, they had been legally discriminated against even before the Nazis came to power. For instance, the Prussian police in particular had special offices to try and regulate gypsies, and local authorities frequently harassed them into moving away. And even since 1929, during the Weimar Republic, gypsies were forbidden from roaming the land in large groups and were required to register with the authorities. They could also face 2 years of forced labour if they couldn't prove that they'd been working regularly. So they were a group that was persecuted against, and a group that was generally regarded by ordinary Germans with hostility and suspicion, and therefore the Nazis were able to get away with some horrendous policies towards them, again without opposition. So thinking about the Nazi views. Now, Nazis really didn't like the 30,000 gypsies, or 26,000 if we're being more specific, that were living in Germany. And they decided that they wanted to persecute them more and more over time. Now, generally, they didn't attract as much attention and policies against them as Jewish people because they were a smaller group and they hadn't played such a central role in the economy. Although over time, lots of policies that they put in place against the Jews are also then subsequently applied to the Roma and Sinti as well. So why are the Roma and Sinti treated so awfully by the Nazis? Now, generally they were treated harsher than asocials because they were seen as both being a social threat and a social outsider because they have a different dialect and customs and lifestyle. And also they were seen as being a biological and racial threat to the pure German blood that they wanted to keep. So this is just a little bit about the background of the Roma and Sinti. Remember that hostility and persecution of them was nothing new, and they were seen by the Nazis as being a social and biological threat, and they were generally viewed with hostility by the German population. Next, we're going to think about the policies towards the Roma and Sinti and what happened to them over time. This slide is going to think about what they did before the Second World War, and in the next slide we'll think about the impact of war on their policies. So first of all, in the immediate years after 1933, 26 to 30,000 gypsies within Nazi Germany found that the established laws that had been around already that allowed them to be discriminated against were now upheld with a new enthusiasm. At a local level, a number of regional states implemented new laws and stepped up the levels of harassment. For instance, gypsies were increasingly vulnerable to raids and arrests and could be arrested if they hadn't been working and they couldn't prove that they'd been working in a set time period. Now, by November 1935, the national Nazi policy towards the Roma and Sinti became much clearer. In 1935, in September, after a Nuremberg rally, Hitler had announced the Nuremberg laws. And from November, they decided to apply these to gypsies as well, as they defined them as having alien blood. And remember that one of the Nuremberg laws is aimed with trying to maintain the pure German blood, and therefore the Roma and Sinti are a threat to this. So after they had created this law that said that, Germans needed to make sure they maintained pure blood, they then had to try and make sure that they could purely categorize people according to racial criteria, and they needed to actually come up with a better definition of what made a gypsy. So the Nazis then decided to try and create the Central Office for the Fight Against the Gypsy Nuisance in 1936. And this was an organisation that was set up by the SS, because remember, the SS are in control of the Nazi racial policy. This agency took over and extended bureaucratic measures to systematically persecute the Roma and was led by a man called Dr. Ritter. Now, Dr. Ritter of the SS became the scientific advisor and helped the SS to classify and locate gypsies. He particularly wanted to find people that he viewed as being the mongrels who had fully integrated into German society and therefore who were more of a threat to this idea of purely German Aryan blood. Himmler fully supported the work of Dr. Ritter, which is no surprise as head of the SS, and in 1938, to show his support for his work, he also issued the decree for the struggle against the Gypsy Plague, which again just went on about more systematic classification of exactly who is a gypsy. Now, by 1939, Dr. Ritter had been working on this for a while. He had decided that the best thing to do was to try and sterilise the Roma and Sinti and do that on a mass scale because he saw them as a threat to the Aryan race. Essentially, he'd seen that before the kind of heritage of the gypsies was actually Aryan, but their blood, he believed, had been corrupted through migration, and he believed they were a threat to Germany, so he decided to try and deal with it through sterilisation on a more formal basis. Now, this had been going on an ad hoc basis since 1936, but it became more widely carried out from 1938 and 1939. So that's what their policies were like before the war, essentially locating them, making them feel as if they're separate and other and somehow alien, and then this policy of sterilisation as well. And obviously things are going to get more extreme during the Second World War. The last area that you need to know about for policies towards the Roma and Sinti is how World War II impacted on the policies towards them. Now, first of all, the Nazis achieved a quick victory over Poland in September 1939, and it meant after that the Roma and Sinti could now be deported to the general government area. The deportations were immediately delayed, but they had begun by 1940 and carried on throughout 1941. Now, there is a difference between the way that they are treated in the West and the East, just like with the Jewish communities as well. So gypsies that came from the West were generally treated severely, with many meeting their deaths in the network of concentration camps. They were given things like black triangle patches to represent that they were asocials, or green ones for being professional criminals. There wasn't a set triangle for them to identify them in the camps, but many of them still ended up there. However, the gypsies that were living in Eastern Europe were treated even worse, and as part of the Eisengruppen's work, a lot of gypsies were actually shot and killed from 1941, just like many Jewish people were as well. From December 1942, after the beginning of the final solution to the so-called Jewish problem, Himmler also decided to do something about the gypsies, and he created a camp for pure gypsies because they were viewed as being valuable for research. So not ones that had so-called mixed blood, but the people that seemed to have purely gypsy blood, which they've been researching, remember, since 1936. Now they're keeping them alive there to be able to perform some experiments and carry out some research. However, as they were still living in places like Auschwitz-Birkenau, the living conditions were atrocious, and lots of gypsies actually died from diseases like typhus. Other people that weren't seen as being pure Roma and Sinti were sent to the gas chambers along with many other people as well. It's estimated that out of about 30,000 that were around in Germany before the war, only 5,000 German gypsies survived. It's really difficult to know exactly how many European Roma and Sinti were killed as a result of the Nazi policies, because they didn't have exact numbers and they weren't recorded in each country with exactly how many people there were because of their lifestyle. But it's estimated that around 25% of all European gypsies were killed, and we think that it's at least 220,000, although some historians say it was as many as 500,000 innocent Roma and Sinti that were murdered. So pause the video here if you need to make any notes about policies towards the Roma and Sinti. Make sure you show that things changed over time and became more extreme as a result of the Second World War. Well done for getting to the end of this video. You've now heard a knowledge overview of this key topic of 5.1. It's now really important that you do something with it. You might decide to make a Cornell grid, you might make some kind of mind map, revision clock, whatever works best for you, but please do make some detailed revision notes using this, but you also might want to carry out some additional reading too. Once you've done some revision on this topic, I would then try out a red pen, black pen activity. Again, just like you did at the beginning, start fresh and write down everything you can remember on the topic as a whole, or specific areas like, for instance, policies towards the Roma and Sinti. Then you need to look back at your notes and add the bits you missed in a second colour. This is really useful as it shows you what you actually remember. Once you've done that, you might then decide to plan out some exam questions. This is always the best thing that you can do. And remember, you've got loads of different questions to practice in your black folders. And they're all organised by the unit, and you'd be looking for Unit 5. Here's an example of a question that you could think about planning. Hitler's policies towards minority groups in the years 1933 to 1941 were consistent. You could do a revision activity where you think about each of the different groups, for instance, the policies towards disabled, the Roma and Sinti, asocials, homosexuals, and you could think about what you'd argue for each group. Would you say for every group that the policies were consistent? Were they more consistent for some other than others? Did they change over time? Did they all have the same aim? Think about all of your arguments that you could use in an exam based on these groups that are in the video. And if you're still feeling unsure, you could have to watch the video again to kind of remind yourself over those key facts. Okay, so make sure you're doing something with it. And next I'm just going to have a quick talk to you about the short answer test. So finally, as part of your revision, you might decide to locate the 5.1 radicalisation of the state short answer test that is on Teams. Here you've got 36 different questions that cover most of the information from this PowerPoint. Obviously the short answer test is supposed to be quite short and so it won't cover everything, but it could be worth making some flashcards to be able to test what you can remember from this video. Okay, well done for getting to the end of this Unit 5 video. Hope the revision goes well.